everybody, welcome to another VEG Out video with CCUA. Today is story time with Saxon, and I have two books to read to you today. First is The Boy Who Didn't Believe in Spring by Lucille Clifton. And though spring has certainly sprung around here, it does feel a little chilly the last few days, so I thought that would be a fun book to read. And then we have a book called Dandelions, Stars in the Grass by Posado. And this morning, Clint talked to everybody about ways to use dandelions. So I thought that would also be a timely book to read. We'll start with this one. Once upon a time, there was a little boy named King Shabazz who didn't believe in spring. No such thing, he would whisper every time the teacher talked about spring at school. Where's it at? He would holler every time his mama talked about spring at home. He used to sit with his friend Tony Polito on the bottom step when the days started getting longer and warmer and talk about it. Everybody's talking about spring, he would say to Tony. Big deal, Tony would say back. No such thing, he would say to Tony. Right, Tony would say back. One day, after the teacher had been talking about birds that were blue and his mama had started talking about crops coming up, King Shabazz decided he had had just enough. He put his jacket on and his shades and went by for Tony Polito. Look here, man, said King when they got out to the bottom step. I'm gonna go get me some spring. What do you mean, man? Tony asked. Everybody's talking about spring coming, and spring's just around the corner. I'm gonna go around there and see what do I see. Tony Polito watched King Shabazz get up and push his shades right up on his nose. You coming with me, man? He said while he was pushing. Tony Polito thought about it for a minute. Then he got up and turned his cap around backwards. Right, Tony Polito said. King Shabazz and Tony Polito had been around the corner before, but only as far as the street light alone. They passed the school and the playground. Ain't no spring in there, said King Shabazz with a laugh. Sure ain't, agreed Tony Polito. They passed Wiseman's. They stopped for a minute by the side door at Wiseman's and smelled the buns. Sure do smell good, whispered Tony. But it ain't spring, King was quick to answer. They passed the apartments and walked fast in case they met Junior Williams. He was not a friendly guy. Then they were at the street light. Tony stopped and made believe his sneaker was untied to see what King was going to do. King stopped and blew on his shades to clean them and see what Tony was going to do. They stood there for 2 light turns, and then King Shabazz grinned at Tony Polito, and he grinned back, and the two boys ran across the street. Well, if we find it, it ought to be now. Tony didn't say anything. He just stood looking around. Well, come on, man, King whispered, and they started down the street. They passed the church of the solid rock with high windows, all decorated and pretty. They passed a restaurant with little round tables near the window. They came to a takeout shop and stood by the door a minute to smell the barbecue. Sure would like to have some of that, whispered King. Me too, whispered Tony. Just after they passed some apartments, King Shabazz and Tony Polito came to a vacant lot. It was small and had high walls from apartments on 3 sides of it. 3 walls around it, and right in the middle, a car. It was beautiful. The wheels were gone, and so were the doors, but it was dark red, and sitting high on a dirt mound in the middle of the lot. Man, oh man, they whispered. Then they heard a noise. It was a little long sound like smooth things rubbing against rough, and it was coming from the car. King looked at Tony and grabbed his hand. "Let's see what that is," he whispered. He thought Tony would say no and let's go home. Tony looked at King and held his hand tightly. "Right," he said very slowly. The boys stood there a minute, then began tiptoeing over toward the car. They almost tripped and fell. Then they looked down and saw a patch of little tiny yellow flowers with pointy leaves coming up. "Man, I think you tripped on these crops," King laughed. "They're coming up," Tony shouted. "Man, the crops are coming up." And just as Tony was making all that noise, they heard another noise, like a lot of things waving in the air. And they looked over at the car, and 3 birds flew out of one of the door holes and up to the walls of the apartment. King and Tony ran over to the car to see where the birds had been. They had to climb up a little to go get to the door and look in. They stood there looking a long time without saying anything. There on the front seat, down in a whole lot of cottony stuff, was a nest. There in the nest were 4 light blue eggs. Blue. King took off his shades. "Man, it's spring," he said, almost to himself. "Anthony Polito!" King and Tony jumped down off the mound. Somebody was shouting for Tony as loud as he could. "Anthony Polito!" The boys turned and started walking out of the vacant lot. Tony's brother Sam was standing at the edge of the lot looking mad. "Ma's gonna be mad at you," he hollered. King Shabazz looked at Tony Polito and took his hand. "Spring is here," he whispered to Tony. "Right." That's that by Lucille Clifton. The next one is Dandelions, Stars in the Grass. And this book talks a little bit about summertime, but as we all have probably noticed, there are quite a few dandelions already poking out and blooming, and I even noticed some dandelion seed heads out in my yard the other day. I know that some people call it a weed, but to me, the dandelion is a noble breed. Bright yellow petals adorn each one, spreading out like rays of the sun. In spring, dandelions bloom like gold stars in the grass, growing taller and taller as the warm days pass. Under sunny summer skies, the flowers are visited by bees and butterflies. The flowers begin to change one summer day. Their bright yellow petals fold up and fall away. In place of petals emerge fluffy tufts of white. They form a perfect circle, delicate and light. The wind blows them loose, sweeping them into the sky. Like tiny umbrellas, they float up high. Every flying tuft the wind has freed carries with it a tiny seed. The tufts float on the wind until falling to rest. A nice grassy hillside is what they like best. Into the soil a seed snuggles down, slender new roots tunnel deep underground. Fragile green leaves begin to grow, sprouting up from the earth below. Look closely and you'll find round buds of green, but bright yellow petals are yet to be seen. The buds slowly open, facing the sky. Sunlight and water will help them grow high. As summer moves on, sunny and warm, seeds become flowers, and new dandelions form. Okay, guys, thanks for watching. I hope that you have a good, safe weekend, and tune in on Monday for another Veg Out video, and again next Friday around 1 p.m. for another story time. This time I'll be reading about peas. Take care.